Weeding is an essential task in any vegetable garden. There are lots of methods and approaches to managing a garden that can greatly reduce or increase the amount of weeding that needs to be done. But it isn't a task that can be eliminated, as there's always going to be at least a few plants growing where you don't want them to. I have used many different types of tools to help with weeding, depending on the type of weed, how old or established the plants are, and of course the context or method used in that particular garden. A few years ago, I started experimenting with using a simple piece of bent wire with a section flattened with a hammer. And this simple DIY tool has become our favorite, the tool that we most commonly use in the gardens. This simple tool that we make ourselves is not useful for all situations, and the fact that we use it so much has more to do with how developed the gardens are after a lot of work, and because of our general approach of weeding very frequently. For many years, this tool would not have been so useful, especially when the growing spaces were first being established, usually taking over rough ground with lots of mature perennial and pernicious weeds. Scutch or couch grass is widespread in the area where the gardens have been established, and there also have been pockets of bindweed, as well as a fair amount of creeping thistle. These are all hard weeds to deal with, and we usually dig the rhizome and creeping root network out where we can, coming back later to dig or pull out any shoots that reappear, a task that typically needs to be done many times over several months, or even years. And we also have used ground cover fabric, cardboard, or some other covering, though this can also take quite a while and rarely is 100% effective, even when we've been very careful with the covering. With the ubiquitous dandelion and dock plants, which have a deep tap roots, we usually end up just digging them out or putting a flat rock over the plant until it dies. So with all these perennial weeds and a few others, we either dig them out or cover them up to get rid of them. I have tried the chop and drop approach in the past a few times, but I often found that I let these plants go to seed, allowing them to disperse the seeds across the gardens, creating even more weeding in the future. Over the years, I've inadvertently added a lot of weed seeds to the gardens, from weeds and crops that I let go to seed in the gardens, to seeds that survived the composting process and I spread back onto the gardens in the compost, and the seeds that blew into the gardens from the surrounding landscape every season. And all of this has been added to the significant bank of weed seeds that had built up in the soil over many seasons before I even started the gardens. I've become a lot better at keeping most of these undesirable seeds out of the gardens, and by using no-till methods on some of the growing spaces, I'm able to prevent bringing up a fresh load of these seeds from deeper in the soil to germinate. And in the gardens that I still cultivate, the seed bank has been gradually diminishing with each passing season. But for quite a few years, I had to deal with a large flush of annual weed seedlings in the spring or whenever I prepared a bed. For these smaller weeds, I have relied on a lot of hand weeding and flame weeding empty beds, but my favorite tool for dealing with them used to be the oscillating hoe. This is essentially a double-edged blade on the end of a long handle that adjusted when dragged back and forth over the soil so that the blade was drawn just below the surface, slicing the small weeds off at the roots. This will kill most small annual weeds with one pass, though if the blade isn't sharp enough, it tended to simply drag the whole seedling to another location, essentially transplanting it, often requiring another pass later to kill it. I've also used this tool quite a bit with larger weeds, and even when killing off green manure, and it seems to be able to withstand considerable force. We still use this oscillating hoe a lot, as it is very useful for weeding full beds and between long rows of crops before they become established. It is also a good tool to use for spot weeding quickly while walking through the garden because we don't have to bend down so much. But most of the weeding we do these days is with a smaller handmade version of a wire weeder. I first read about the possibility of using a simple bent wire to weed in the gardens a long time ago, but I only just started trying it a few years ago. In its simplest form, it is just a piece of thick wire bent at one end to make some form of a handle and bent at the other end so that the wire can be dragged parallel to the ground along the surface of the soil or just beneath it. If the surface of the soil is fairly loose, or at least doesn't have a firm cap, and the weed seedlings are very small, this simple wire can harass and disrupt the weeds enough to cause many of them to dry out and die. These bent wires are especially useful for running down the edge of a row of lettuce or other leafy greens, where the end of the wire can slide underneath the leaves without damaging them, disrupting any weeds that may have sprouted. And this wire tool can be attached to a stick or a long handle, which would allow it to be used while standing, but this is something that we haven't got around to trying yet. There are manufactured versions of this type of wire weeder available for purchase, which are designed specifically for the task and are apparently becoming quite popular with market gardeners. I prefer to flatten the part of the wire that is in contact with the soil, so that it requires less force to drag it through the soil, and is more likely to cut through the roots or stem of the small seedlings, rather than just dragging them to a new location. I've been doing this by simply hammering the end of the wire repeatedly with a hammer against anything solid enough. I've used an anvil, a sledgehammer, a mallet, and even a peening anvil for my scythe. It can be a bit tricky to keep it straight, and no doubt there are easier and more effective ways to do this, which would be useful if I was making a lot of them, but I find that even a roughly flattened section is useful. Then I bend the wire to make one end easier to grip, and so that the flat part can run parallel to the ground when using it. The angles that I bend it to depends on how high or low I want to hold the wire, which depends on the crop or situation. For weeding in between tall crops like onions, I tend to want to hold the tool more vertically, so I bend the flattened part to be more perpendicular to the handle. Using this simple tool to weed under larger plants like potatoes, I find it useful to hold the wire more horizontally, with the flattened end more in line with the handle. But in general, I find about a 45-degree angle to be most useful in most situations, and tend to leave it like that. As with many tools that I use in the gardens, I find that a sharper edge often makes a task easier and more effective. So I have been sharpening the edge of these wire weeders with a file, which can be tricky without a vise or something else to firmly hold the wire, and it does help to have a sharp file. I've found that for most work, the edge doesn't have to be really sharp, but the stony soil that we have around here will definitely dull the edge, so I try to file it sharp again every so often. And it does depend on how hard or soft the metal in the original wire is to begin with. As the harder the metal is, the longer the edge will last. But apparently the hammering will harden the metal even more, making it more durable and allow it to stay sharper for longer. I've also used a peening hammer and an anvil that I use to draw out an edge on my scythe to produce an edge on the wire, and although I don't have the skill to produce an even edge this way, it is still quite effective. And I've found that the careful use of an angle grinder with a flap disc can grind a suitable edge really quickly. The first few wire weeders that I made were with the reasonably thin wire that I had on hand at the time, which wasn't strong enough as a single wire to work well, so I simply doubled up the wire, winding it around itself to produce a hoop section to be flattened. This works well for around some plants, as it reduces the risk for cutting the plant, but it doesn't work well for getting under leaves. I now prefer a simple hook fashioned out of a thicker wire, as it is more versatile for using around leafy crops. And I have found that the metal wire handle from the plastic buckets that we have are perfect for making these tools. I got a load of these recycled buckets years ago, and they've been very useful in the gardens, but the plastic doesn't last forever, and I've been collecting a number of handles, not knowing what to do with them. But now I turn most of them into wire weeders. The metal seems quite hard, and the wire is thick enough to need a pair of pliers to bend it effectively, and it takes a lot of hammering to produce the flat part, but the resulting weeder works really well. I like leaving the little knob on the end, as it helps to keep the sharpened edge from the base of the plants, and the plastic handle piece can still be used, making the tool more comfortable to hold onto. The design of these tools has evolved quite a bit and will likely continue to change. I really like that I can adjust them when needed, or that I can create different ones with different shapes, lengths, and angles to suit the diverse range of crops and the context in the gardens. And they are essentially free, taking up only a bit of time, limited skill, and some common tools to create. I really like that I can leave these wire weeders in different parts of the garden so that there's usually one close by to be able to use, unlike all the other tools which we need to keep locked away in a more secure location, which actually makes them less useful. They are also light and easy to carry, or to hang on the edge of a bucket or bin, so that we can use them whenever a bit of weeding needs to be done when we are in the gardens harvesting or doing other tasks. Because we have already gotten rid of most of the pernicious and perennial weeds from most of the growing spaces, we mostly have to deal with the annual weeds from seedlings that recently germinated. And we're also trying to maintain a routine of weeding very frequently, at least once a week or two, which means that most of the weeds that we deal with are still quite small. And with a lot of the growing spaces being managed with minimum tillage, it tends to be only new weed seeds that are blown in that we have to deal with. And as the seed bank in the soil is gradually depleted, we no longer have to deal with a huge flush of weed seedlings when we do till the soil. There are still some patches of perennial weeds, but they are quite weak, and the growing shoots that appear can usually be cut back with a sharp wire weeder. If we were growing long beds of similar crops, then a purpose-built tool with a long handle would probably be more useful. But because we grow smaller batches of a wide range of crops, I find a shorter and more maneuverable tool is a lot more useful for getting in and around all of the different types of plants. So most of the weeding that we do is frequent spot weeding of seedlings and small plants, often while we're in the gardens doing other tasks, which these wire weeders are really good for. The fact that we can make these tools ourselves out of old bucket handles that are just lying around is a real bonus. And I'm intrigued how the design of these tools will continue to evolve in the future.